The night Keanu Reeves walked beside Sandra Bullock in pure peace. It began with silence, not the kind that demands answers, but the kind that wraps around a moment like a warm blanket. Still and sacred, too perfect to speak through. The sky over Los Angeles had just begun to bruise with the indigo touch of dusk, and the city lights blinked awake like stars returning to their posts. Keanu Reeves stood quietly on the rooftop of a quiet mid-rise building in Silver Lake, one hand loosely tucked into the pocket of his black overcoat, the other wrapped around a cup of still-warm herbal tea he'd brewed himself in a chipped ceramic mug that once belonged to his mother. The city murmured below, horns, the flutter of wings, the occasional howl of a distant dog. But up here, in this little skybox of peace, the world felt slowed down, as if time were honoring the sacredness of something yet to happen. He had just finished reading a page from a book of Rainer Maria Rilke's letters, his favorite passage about letting life happen to you, about loving the questions themselves and not rushing for answers. He whispered it softly, as if offering it to the wind. Be patient toward all that is unsolved in your heart and try to love the questions themselves. That's when the old elevator doors creaked open behind him. He didn't turn around immediately. He didn't need to. Her presence was unmistakable, like remembering a song you didn't realize you still knew. The click of gentle heels, a soft exhale, and then that voice, low, warm, slightly amused. I always forget how quiet you get when you're thinking. "Kay." Sandra Bullock stood a few steps behind him, her arms crossed but her posture open, as if she'd been summoned by something neither of them had said aloud but both had felt for years. She wasn't wearing makeup. Her hair was loosely tied back. Her coat was too big, her boots scuffed, and yet to Keanu, she looked like the very soul of home, worn in, familiar, beautiful because she wasn't trying to be. "You came," he said, and his voice didn't need to rise above a whisper. That was the magic between them. Words were always optional. She moved beside him, leaned on the railing, and they both stared out into the city's golden glow for a long moment. The silence returned, not awkward, not heavy, just full. It was the kind of silence that came after years of knowing someone's scars without asking about them. The kind that understood every heartbreak and every healing without needing to be told. "I had a dream about your sister last night," Sandra said finally. She was laughing. "She kept calling me the one who gets it." Keanu's jaw tightened slightly, the ache of memory always living somewhere behind his eyes. "Kim always liked you," he said. "Said you were the only person who didn't treat her like she was sick." Sandra smiled, but it was a sad smile. "She wasn't sick to me. She was just real." Keanu nodded. He could feel that part of him open again, the place that hurt because it once loved so deeply. "That's why I invited you," he said. "Not for the rooftop, not for the tea, but because tonight felt like it needed something real." She looked at him now, her expression unreadable. "Are you okay?" she asked. Not in the usual way people ask it. "But really, are you okay, Keanu?" He didn't answer for a long time. Then he said something he hadn't told anyone in years. "Some nights I still dream of driving home and seeing my son running up the stairs." Her eyes softened. She reached out and gently took the mug from his hand, setting it on the ledge. Then she placed her hand over his. "I never knew him," she said, "but I know you, and I know what kind of father you would have been." That did it. A tear slipped down his cheek. Not because he was weak, but because the armor had been held too long. And when Sandra saw it, she didn't look away. She didn't flinch. She stepped forward and pulled him into an embrace so gentle, so real, that it felt like gravity itself had softened around them. For a moment he let himself be held, not as the stoic, silent hero the world always made him out to be, but as the man who had lost and loved and survived anyway. They stood like that for a long time. When they finally pulled apart, Keanu let out a breath that seemed to carry years of pain. "Why is it that we always find each other in the quiet?" he asked. Sandra tilted her head. "Because the noise never suited us," she said. "Because peace is the only place we ever told the truth." They both laughed, soft and knowing, like old souls recognizing each other again in a different life. And then, without saying another word, Keanu reached into his coat and pulled out a folded letter. "I was going to send this," he said, "but I figured it was better read out loud." She took it, unfolding it carefully. Her fingers trembled slightly as she read, "To the woman who always knew what I meant before I said it. To the soul that once sat beside mine on a bus and made time stop. To the one who never asked for the truth but always saw it anyway. I think we were always walking beside each other even when the roads didn't meet. Maybe this world was too loud. Maybe our timing was always quiet. But if I ever find a lifetime where peace walks on 2 feet and laughter wears boots, I hope it looks like you." When she finished, her eyes were glassy. She folded the letter and pressed it to her chest. "I've been waiting to hear that," she whispered. "Since the first night I made you laugh so hard you cried." He smiled. "Speed?" he asked. "No," she said. "Our first interview. You looked terrified. I told you your shirt was inside out." They both laughed. And just like that, 1,000 invisible threads between them tightened, stitched back together by time, truth, and something deeper than either of them could name. The stars had come out now. The city stretched below them like a river of light. Keanu offered his hand. "Walk with me." She took it. Always. And so they did, not for the cameras, not for the world, but for each other. Down the creaky elevator, through the quiet streets, their footsteps soft, in sync, like a song they'd always known but never finished. 2 souls, side by side, not speaking much because they didn't need to. The night didn't need dialogue. It just needed them. Together. The city was quieter than usual that night, or maybe it just felt that way because something between them had shifted. Subtly, profoundly, Keanu and Sandra stepped out from the old building, their shadows falling softly under the dim halo of a flickering streetlight. There was a strange grace in how they moved. No urgency, no purpose in their steps except to walk together. They didn't rush toward anything, nor did they need to. The moment itself was enough. And maybe, just maybe, this was what life had always tried to offer them in fleeting glimpses. A sacred walk that asked nothing, a silent vow shared not through words, but through presence. Their hands brushed once, and again. Then finally, Sandra slipped her fingers into his without looking down, and Keanu simply closed his hand around hers as if it had always belonged there. There was no fanfare, no grand confessions, just peace. Real peace. The kind that neither of them had known in years. It wasn't romantic in the way the world defined it. It was deeper, more ancient. The kind of connection that didn't need labels, didn't need rules. It simply was. They passed a small diner still open on the corner, flickering neon sign, the smell of burnt coffee and grilled onions curling through the air. Keanu stopped. "You hungry?" Sandra smiled, always. But only if they still have those old booths with cracked leather seats. He held the door open for her. Cracked leather, bad coffee, and one grumpy waitress. That's the real 5-star experience. Inside, the place was nearly empty. An older man sipped soup near the window, and a young couple sat in the back arguing softly over a shared plate of fries. The air buzzed faintly with an old jazz song, playing from a jukebox that looked like it hadn't been touched since the 80s. The waitress, a woman in her 60s with gray curls and a name tag that read Linda, glanced up and froze for a second when she saw them. But then something in her eyes softened, as if she could sense what this night meant and chose, with quiet grace, to treat them not like celebrities, but like any 2 souls needing space. "Sit wherever," she said with a smile. "Window's good tonight." They chose the booth farthest from the noise, where the light was dim and the window looked out onto a crooked lamppost and a closed bookstore. Keanu slid into the booth and leaned back, his eyes taking in the familiarity of it all. "I used to come here after long shoots," he said. Ordered the same thing every time. Grilled cheese, tomato soup, chamomile tea. Sandra raised an eyebrow. "You, chamomile?" He chuckled. "Helps me sleep. Or at least it used to." Her eyes softened. "Do you still have trouble sleeping?" He didn't answer right away. Then, "Sometimes. It's not the nightmares anymore. It's the emptiness. The quiet gets too loud. She nodded, understanding more than she could say. I get it. I spent months after my divorce waking up at 2 a.m. just to hear something. Anything. Even if it was just my fridge humming. A beat passed. Then she added, funny how silence can be both comfort and curse. The waitress came by and took their order without asking questions. When she walked away, Keanu leaned forward, his voice lower now. You ever wonder why we never really tried? The question hung between them like mist. Sandra's fingers traced the rim of her water glass. I think we were always afraid, she said. Not of each other, but of what it would cost. The timing was never right. Someone was always healing, or running, or hiding. Keanu nodded slowly. And maybe the world made too much noise around us. Sandra's eyes met his. But what if we were always supposed to find our way back like this? Quietly, slowly, on our own terms. He held her gaze, something unspoken moving between them. Then let's not waste the quiet this time. Their food arrived, simple, imperfect, warm. And as they ate, they shared stories not about movies or fame, but about the tiny things that no one ever asked them about. Sandra told him about how she once drove 6 hours alone just to sit in a field and cry because the world felt too heavy. Keanu told her about the time he bought a homeless man lunch and ended up talking with him for 4 hours about astronomy and loss. They spoke not like stars, but like strangers who had waited their whole lives to be understood. No masks, no jokes to deflect the truth. Just presence. After an hour, they left the diner and walked toward the park nearby, the same one they had walked through years ago during the filming of the lake house. Only this time, it wasn't a scene. It was real. The air had cooled, and Sandra wrapped her coat tighter around her. Without a word, Keanu took off his own and draped it over her shoulders. You'll freeze, she protested, but he just smiled. I've been colder before. They reached a bench overlooking the small lake. The moon reflected perfectly across the rippling water. Keanu sat down and Sandra joined him, resting her head lightly against his shoulder. For a long time, they didn't speak. And in that silence, everything that had been left unsaid between them over the years began to settle like dust, quietly, respectfully, and finally. Did you ever regret not having a family? Sandra asked softly. I mean, not in the way people expect you to, but in the way that keeps you up at night. Keanu took a long breath. Sometimes, I used to imagine birthdays, school plays, watching a child fall asleep knowing I helped build a world safe enough for them to dream. His voice cracked slightly, and she reached for his hand. He continued, but I also think some souls were sent here to be family in other ways, to hold space, to walk beside, to offer stillness in a loud world. He looked at her now. You've been that for me, even when we weren't near. Sandra felt the tears rise unexpectedly. She didn't hide them. You've been that for me too. The thought of you has carried me through some of the loneliest moments of my life. And there it was again, that invisible thread between them, stretching, glowing, eternal. Not love in the typical sense. Not the kind of romance that fit into headlines or scripts. This was something older, something sacred, a knowing, a remembering, a peace only found when two souls recognize they've been walking side by side through lifetimes, even if the world forgot to notice. A breeze stirred the surface of the lake. Leaves rustled gently above them. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell rang once. Midnight. A new day. Keanu stood slowly and offered her his hand again. Come with me, he said. She didn't ask where. She just followed. They walked in silence through the sleeping streets, past old bookstores and shuttered bakeries. Finally, they arrived at a small, almost hidden garden behind a building no one really noticed. A garden Keanu had helped plant years ago in memory of his daughter, whose name was never printed in the tabloids but who lived on in every rose he tended. He unlocked the gate with a small key from his pocket. Inside, soft lights glowed beneath the soil, illuminating patches of lavender, rose, and white lilies. In the center stood a small bench, and behind it, an engraved stone. Sandra stepped closer, reading the words aloud. In this soil rests love that never left. Her throat tightened. "Is this for her?" He nodded. "For her. For the mother she never met. For the part of me that only knows how to love quietly." Sandra turned to him. "Why bring me here?" He hesitated only a moment. "Because I wanted you to see where I go when I need peace. And because tonight, for the first time, I don't feel alone here." She reached up, brushing a strand of hair behind his ear. "You never were." And then she kissed his forehead. Not a romantic kiss, not a possessive one, but a blessing. A touch of grace. The garden seemed to breathe around them. The night held them in its gentle arms. And in that sacred space, they stood together, not as stars, not as actors, but as souls that had survived, healed, and somehow found their way back to each other. The morning light hadn't yet touched the horizon, but the quiet before dawn carried a different kind of truth, the kind that doesn't need to prove itself through grand declarations or perfect timing. It simply arrives and settles like dew on a sleeping rose, soft and undeniable. Keanu and Sandra sat together in the heart of the hidden garden, the air still carrying the gentle scent of lavender and earth warmed by memory. Neither of them had spoken for what felt like an hour, but the silence wasn't empty. It was full of everything they hadn't known how to say for years. The past had once been heavy between them, a weight neither of them dared touch for fear it would reopen wounds stitched shut with quiet endurance. But now, in the presence of morning's hush and the echo of shared grief, the past no longer held power to divide. It had transformed into a bridge, connecting the raw, hidden parts of their souls that had long waited to be seen. Sandra's fingers ran softly over the stone again, the one Keanu had carved for the daughter the world never knew. Her voice, when it finally returned, was low, almost reverent. "There's a stillness here I haven't felt in years, Key. It's like your pain planted something that turned into peace." He nodded slowly, his eyes fixed on the lilies that bloomed in uneven patches, not perfect, but thriving. It took me a long time to stop asking why. For years, all I did was replay the hospital hallway, the phone call, the silence after. I couldn't understand how something so full of promise could be taken without warning. His voice broke slightly, but he didn't turn away. But then I realized maybe some lives are never meant to stay. Maybe they come just long enough to remind us what love actually is. Sandra watched him, not as a friend, not as an actress seated beside a co-star, but as a soul who had loved and lost, and in her own way understood exactly what he meant. She placed her hand on his knee, grounding him with her presence. "You didn't lose her, Keanu. You became more because of her. You held on to the beauty. That's what this place is. It's not a grave, it's a garden of who you still are." The words sank into him like water into cracked earth. It was rare for anyone to speak to him this way, to not tiptoe around his pain, but to honor it, to meet it face to face and still stay beside him. That perhaps was Sandra's quiet superpower. She had always known when to speak and when to simply sit in silence, offering no answers but all the presence in the world. He looked up at her now, really looked. Her face was softer than it used to be, time having painted gentle lines around her eyes and mouth, but there was something even more luminous beneath that, a quiet wisdom, a soul unafraid of scars. "You've changed," he said. "Since the last time I really saw you, there's something quieter in you, something deeper." She smiled, but it was a bittersweet smile. "Grief will do that. Losing people, losing versions of yourself, it burns away the noise. You start listening differently. You stop trying to be understood by the world, and you start learning how to understand yourself." Her gaze drifted to the edge of the garden, where vines curled around an old wooden arch. "Do you know the last time I felt truly held by someone?" she asked, not waiting for a reply. "It was when my mom was dying. I crawled into her hospital bed at 3 in the morning and just curled up next to her. We didn't say anything. She just placed her hand on my head, and in that moment, I wasn't a grown woman, or an actress, or a mother, or a divorcee. I was just her little girl again. Held. Known. Loved." Keanu felt the words pierce something inside him, not painfully but deeply. "We spend so much of our lives building things," he said. careers, personas, homes, but all we really want is to be held, not just physically, but in the way someone sees you and doesn't flinch. Sandra nodded slowly. And I think, you've always held me like that, even when we weren't in the same room, even when we didn't talk for years. I always knew you saw me. A long pause passed between them, but it didn't feel heavy. It felt sacred, like the garden was listening, like the ghosts of their pasts had pulled up chairs to bear witness. And then, without quite realizing it, Keanu reached for her hand again, not as a gesture, not as a reflex, but as a promise. She took it, her thumb brushing across his knuckles, grounding him in the moment. "Come with me," he said again, repeating the words from earlier, but this time they carried more weight. He stood, and she followed, not because she needed to know where they were going, but because she trusted that wherever it was, it would be honest. They walked through the city as the sky slowly bled into soft oranges and pinks, the world beginning to stir but still caught in the fragile stillness between night and morning. Keanu led her to a place she had never seen before, an old bookstore tucked between two crumbling buildings on a side street no tourist would ever find. He pulled out a key, unlocked the front door, and pushed it open. Dust floated in the beams of early sunlight like tiny dancers. The air smelled of old paper, wood, and time. "This place," he said, "belonged to a man who once told me that stories save people. Not always in loud ways. Sometimes they just sit beside you on your darkest days and remind you that you're not alone." Sandra walked between the aisles, her fingers brushing across the spines of forgotten novels and poetry collections. "Is it yours now?" He nodded. "He passed away, left it to me. Said I was the only one who ever came in and didn't just look for answers, but sat with the questions." She turned to face him, her eyes wide with something between awe and ache. "This is who you are, Kay. You're not just an actor. You're a keeper of silence, a protector of peace. And the world doesn't know how badly it needs that." He didn't respond. He didn't need to. Instead, he walked to a small table in the back, opened a drawer, and pulled out a notebook. It was old, the cover worn, the pages yellowed. He handed it to her. "Read it." She opened it gently, flipping past pages filled with poems, sketches, letters. Some were addressed to people she recognized, others to people who may have never existed outside his mind, but every word bled with honesty, realness, depth. She stopped on a page halfway through, her breath catching. It was a sketch of her, not glamorous, not red carpet ready, just her sitting at a table laughing. The caption beneath read, "The moment I realized silence could be shared." Her eyes shimmered. "You kept this?" He nodded. "I never wanted to forget what it felt like to be seen without needing to perform." She looked at him then, truly looked, and something inside her, some wall built from years of protection and performance, began to crumble. "Keanu," she whispered. "What are we doing?" He took a step closer. "I don't know. But for the first time in a long time, I don't need to know. I just want to be here, with you, in this peace." A tear slipped down her cheek and he wiped it gently with the back of his hand. "You've always brought me peace," she said, "even when I didn't know how to ask for it." He leaned in, pressing his forehead to hers. "Then let's stop asking. Let's just be." And so they stood there, in the heart of the forgotten bookstore, surrounded by stories and silence, grief and grace, and the kind of love that doesn't ask to be named, only to be known. The day continued, not in noise or motion, but in slow, sacred stillness, like a breath being held by the universe itself, unwilling to disturb the fragile space that had opened between them. In the quiet sanctuary of the forgotten bookstore, Keanu and Sandra stood as two souls not meeting for the first time, but rather reuniting in the kind of way only time and truth could arrange. The dust floated around them in golden rays, soft as silk, and there was no sense of the outside world intruding. No fame, no flashing lights, no past hurts chasing them through doorways they'd long since closed. Just this. Two people, finally facing each other without fear. Sandra gently closed the worn notebook filled with his sketches and set it down with a kind of reverence, as if to place it too quickly would disturb something sacred in the air. Her eyes lingered on his for a moment that felt both endless and brand new. "All this time I thought I was walking alone," she whispered, "but it was you, wasn't it? You were always walking just out of sight. I just couldn't turn around." Keanu didn't move. He didn't need to. His presence had always been his greatest strength, not loud or demanding, but still, unshakable. "I never left," he said simply. "I just didn't want to pull you before you were ready to stop running." Her face tightened then, not in anger, but in the kind of soft grief that comes from finally understanding what you didn't see before. "I ran for so long," she said, her voice trembling. "From trust, from vulnerability, from the risk of being hurt again. I built walls so tall even I couldn't see over them. But you waited." He stepped toward her, not with urgency but with a kind of deep, patient certainty. "Because I knew you weren't running from me," he said. "You were running toward something that had to be discovered alone. And I respected that." She looked down at their feet, then back up at his eyes, the same eyes that had held her in moments of laughter on set, in quiet text messages on birthdays, in shared silences at events where the noise of the world always seemed too loud. "Then why now?" she asked. "Why come back into my life like this? Why tonight?" He smiled, not the smile the world knew, but the quiet one reserved for the rare moments when his heart took over. "Because the night was finally quiet enough for you to hear me." She laughed gently, wiping a tear from beneath her lashes. "You make it sound like I've been deaf for years." He shook his head. "Not deaf, just protecting the wrong places." And just like that, the truth of it landed with such weight and grace that neither of them could speak. They simply stood together, eyes meeting, hearts softening, and for the first time in years, they allowed themselves to be seen in full color. Scars, softness, strength, and all. Eventually, Keanu moved toward the back of the bookstore and pulled out an old lockbox from beneath a stack of forgotten hardcovers. He placed it on the counter and opened it with a small brass key that looked older than time. Inside were dozens of letters, handwritten, folded, sealed, some yellowed by time, others crisp with recent ink. "What are these?" Sandra asked, moving closer. "Letters I never sent," Keanu said. "To people I've lost, to versions of myself I've outgrown, to moments I wasn't brave enough to face. I write them, then leave them here, so they don't haunt me." She picked up one, the handwriting unmistakably his. Slow, thoughtful, deliberate. She didn't open it, didn't need to. She could feel the grief and grace inside the paper just by holding it. "Do you ever reread them?" she asked. He shook his head. "No, that would be holding on. This is how I let go." She looked at him then, her heart aching with the beauty of it all. "Keanu, I think I've been holding on to things I didn't even know were hurting me. Old promises, expectations, guilt. I've carried them like trophies of survival, but they were just weights. I want to let go too." He reached behind the counter, pulled out a fresh page, and handed her a pen. "Then start now," he said. "Write something you've never dared say, to anyone, even yourself." Sandra sat slowly at the table, her hands trembling just enough to reveal the weight of what she was about to do. She looked at the blank page, then closed her eyes. And when she began to write, the words came not from her mind, but from that sacred, vulnerable place behind the ribs, the place that only speaks when you're truly ready to listen. Keanu didn't interrupt. He simply watched her, held the silence, and waited. It took her 20 minutes to finish, and when she did, she folded the paper slowly, carefully, as if she was sealing away something that no longer belonged in her present. She didn't read it aloud. She didn't need to. She placed it inside the box beside his, and when she looked back at him, there was something different in her eyes. Not just peace. Liberation. "I don't know what happens now," she said. "Neither do I," he replied. "But maybe that's the point. Maybe the moment we stop needing to know, it's the moment we begin to actually live." They left the bookstore hand in hand, walking back into the golden wash of late morning, where the world had awakened but somehow didn't feel as loud as it used to. There was something different in the air, Not because the world had changed, but because they had. Keanu looked over at her as they walked and said, "Would you come somewhere with me? It's about an hour away." Sandra didn't ask where. She just nodded. Of course. He took her to the edge of the city, where the skyline gave way to hills and open sky. They drove in silence, music low, windows cracked open to let the wind weave between them, and when they arrived it was not to a mansion or a film set or some grand destination. It was a cabin. Small, wooden, set beside a still lake surrounded by pine trees. "I bought this place 20 years ago," Keanu said as they stepped out. "I've only brought 2 people here. One of them was my sister. The other, well, she's buried beneath that tree." Sandra's heart paused as she followed his gaze. A large, ancient tree stood just beyond the cabin, its roots knotted into the earth like a hand holding memory. "This is where I come when I need to remember who I am without the noise, without the grief, without the camera." They entered the cabin, dusty, simple, warm. It smelled of cedar, paper, and something else she couldn't place. Home. Sandra walked to the window and looked out at the lake, its surface like glass, untouched. "Can we stay here?" she asked softly. "Just for a while. Just to breathe." Keanu moved beside her. "That's why I brought you." And so they stayed. They didn't plan anything, didn't check clocks or phones. They cooked small meals together, read aloud from books that had long been forgotten, sat on the porch, as the sun dipped below the trees and silence became their favorite language. And slowly, like winter melting into spring, something began to grow between them. Not rushed, not named, just real. One night, after the fire had burned down to soft, glowing embers and the only light came from the stars blinking above the lake, Sandra looked at him across the small wooden table and said, "I'm not afraid anymore." Keanu tilted his head, a soft question in his eyes. "Of what?" She smiled. "Of being seen, of being held, of being loved, quietly." His eyes shimmered with something too deep for words. "Then let's love each other like that," he said. Quietly, truly, without needing the world to clap for it. She reached for his hand, and when their fingers laced together it felt not like something beginning, but like something finally returning home. The days that followed moved like breath, slow, rhythmic, unnoticed until you stopped and realized you were still alive. Sandra and Keanu had found something in that cabin, something both of them had quietly mourned for years without even knowing its name. The rare and holy space where nothing had to be earned. In the absence of scripts, sets, headlines, and the invisible weight of being who the world expected them to be, they began, slowly and silently, to meet each other for the very first time. Not as characters, not as colleagues, not as names whispered through the corridors of fame, but as simply Keanu and Sandra, 2 souls whose lives had brushed and tangled across decades, never quite losing sight of each other, even when the road had split without explanation. They didn't fill the cabin with stories about their careers or past lovers or regrets they carried like old luggage. Instead, they filled it with music that came from vintage radios, soft clinks of cutlery during breakfast, the gentle creak of wooden steps when one went out for firewood while the other watched from the window with a steaming mug and a quiet heart. There was something sacred about the ordinary. In that simplicity, they were building something the world couldn't touch. Every morning, Sandra would rise before the sun and step outside onto the deck, wrapping herself in Keanu's worn flannel shirt that still smelled of cedar and something older, something like steadiness. She would watch the fog roll across the surface of the lake and feel, for the first time in years, that she was not behind in life. She was right where she was supposed to be. Keanu would join her minutes later, always barefoot, always silent, and he'd hand her a second cup of coffee without needing to ask how she liked it. He remembered. He always remembered. And they'd sit there, shoulder to shoulder, watching the world stretch itself awake. No rush, no roles, No need for smiles manufactured for cameras. They had learned that peace did not come in grand moments of achievement. It came in the soft unfolding of shared breath, in knowing that the person beside you didn't need you to be anything but whole and human. But even paradise has ghosts, and it was during their fourth night at the cabin, under a moon so bright it painted shadows onto the water, that one of them finally knocked at the door. Not physically, not with sound, but through memory. Keanu had been chopping wood earlier, and Sandra found him afterwards standing near the fireplace staring at an old black-and-white photo that rested on the mantel. It was of a woman. Soft smile, quiet eyes, the kind of face that looked like it had once known great pain but had chosen to love anyway. "She was your fiancée," Sandra said gently, not asking, not intruding, just honoring. Keanu nodded. "Jennifer." She laughed with her whole body, and she made me believe I was allowed to be loved, even with all the darkness inside me. Sandra stepped beside him. "What happened?" His eyes stayed on the photo. "Car accident, the kind you don't survive. I got the call while filming. I didn't cry right away. I just stopped breathing. For years." Sandra rested her hand on his arm. "How did you come back from that?" He turned to her, finally meeting her gaze. "I didn't. Not completely. Pieces of me still live in that hospital room. But you—" He paused, voice cracking. "You were the only person who never tried to fix me. You just stayed near." Her eyes welled with tears. "That's because you never asked for fixing. You just needed someone who saw what didn't break." They stood there a long while, the photo between them, the memory now shared instead of carried alone, and in that quiet exchange, something shifted. Not in a dramatic or obvious way, but like an old lock gently clicking open inside them both. Later that night, after the fire had dimmed and they had retreated to their separate rooms, though the walls between them felt thinner now, Sandra pulled out a journal she hadn't touched in years. Its pages were blank, except for one, scribbled, after her divorce when she'd written, "Is there a place where I don't have to pretend I'm okay?" She stared at those words now, realizing she'd finally found that place. Not in a location, not in a cabin, but in a person. Keanu was that place. He always had been. The following morning, she found him down by the lake, sitting on the old dock with his legs hanging over the edge, a book in his lap, but unread. She walked down, wrapped in the same flannel shirt, and without a word, she sat beside him. He didn't look at her. He just asked, "Have you ever thought about disappearing?" She tilted her head. "What do you mean?" "Not running away, not hiding, but choosing to live so quietly that the world forgets to look for you, and in that quiet, you finally hear your own soul again." She thought for a moment. "I think that's what I've been doing since we got here." He nodded. "And?" She smiled. "It doesn't feel like disappearing. It feels like becoming." He turned to her now, really turned, and for a long moment, they just looked at each other, not for answers, not for meaning, but for presence. "I want to build something here," he said, "something that doesn't need applause, a life that whispers instead of shouts, a life that holds." Sandra reached for his hand. "Then let's build it. Not in one day, not with blueprints, but like this, one peaceful hour at a time." And just like that, they began. They spent the next few days planting a small garden behind the cabin, not for survival, not for show, but as an offering. Tomatoes, basil, lavender, a lemon tree in a pot too small for its ambition. They repainted the cabin's creaky front door. They moved furniture around to catch better light in the morning. They read books aloud to each other and took turns choosing poems to leave on the windowsill. They found joy in the rhythm of simplicity. In the way her laugh filled the kitchen when he burned the toast, in how he hummed softly while repairing a cracked drawer, in the way they didn't need to ask before reaching for each other's hand anymore. There was no grand confession of love, no cinematic kiss in the rain, just a quiet, steady unfolding of two lives that had finally found the right tempo. But on the sixth evening, a storm rolled in. Not metaphorically, an actual, raging storm, with wind that howled and rain that pounded against the old roof like memory refusing to be forgotten. They sat by the fire as thunder cracked in the distance, and Keanu looked more restless than usual. Sandra noticed. "Talk to me," she said softly. He shook his head. "It's silly." She placed her hand over his heart. "Nothing about you is silly." He took a long breath. "I get afraid sometimes that this is too good, that we'll go back, that you'll remember the world waiting for you and I'll remember the version of me who doesn't believe he deserves peace." Her fingers brushed his jaw. "Keanu, we are not required to suffer in order to prove we've healed. Peace isn't borrowed, it's built, and we're building it, together." His eyes glistened. "But what if I fail you?" She smiled gently. "Then I'll sit beside you in the failure and remind you that you never had to earn being loved." Outside, the storm raged louder, but inside that cabin there was only stillness, the kind born from understanding. From two people who had walked through fire and finally stopped running. Sandra leaned her head on his shoulder. "Let the world do what it wants," she whispered. "Tonight, the only thing I want to remember is this moment. With you." And in that moment, with the thunder echoing through the hills and the fire casting golden shadows across the walls, they finally kissed, not out of longing, not out of passion, but as a seal, a silent vow, a promise not for perfection, but for presence. It was not fireworks. It was deeper. It was the kiss of two people who had searched the world for home, only to find it waiting quietly in each other's arms. The storm passed by morning. The rain had soaked every inch of earth surrounding the cabin, leaving the air thick with the scent of pine and something else, renewal. Sunlight streamed through the windows like an apology, warm and golden, touching every wooden beam and windowsill like the world was grateful for their patience. Keanu woke first. He lay still for several minutes, watching the soft rise and fall of Sandra's breathing beside him. The way her face looked more peaceful now than he'd ever seen it, as if the years that had pressed down on her had finally exhaled. There was no makeup on her skin, no mask, no performance, just the softness of a soul that had stopped defending itself. And in that quiet, he felt something he hadn't felt in decades. Not happiness, not elation, but belonging. The kind that didn't shout in your chest but settled in your bones, warm and still and sure. He slipped out of bed quietly, pulling on a sweater and stepping out onto the deck barefoot. The lake was still, the water holding the reflection of the trees and sky like a secret. A few birds sang their hesitant morning songs, and the world slowly opened its eyes again. Keanu stared out over the lake and whispered into the wind, not asking for anything, just saying thank you. Inside, Sandra stirred. She reached across the bed instinctively, her hand brushing the sheet where his warmth still lingered. When she opened her eyes and didn't see him, she didn't feel panic. She felt pulled. To him. To the air. To the quiet truth they had stepped into together. She wrapped a blanket around her shoulders and joined him outside. "You always wake up before the world," she said softly, leaning into his side. "I like the world better before it remembers who it's supposed to be," he replied. She smiled. "Then let's not remember either. Let's stay forgotten a little longer." He kissed her forehead, and they stood there in silence for a long time, watching the day begin. Later that afternoon, after breakfast and laughter and a game of cards they both pretended not to be competitive about, Keanu took her hand and said, "I want to show you something." They walked beyond the garden, past the lemon tree and through a narrow trail that curved along the ridge behind the cabin. It was steep in places, the path softened by fallen pine needles and time. When they reached the top, the view opened up. Rolling hills, the lake far below like glass, and the wide expanse of sky stretching out endlessly above. In the middle of that clearing stood a single wooden chair, aged by years of weather but still upright. "This is where I come," he said, "when I need to remember that the world is big, and my pain is small inside it." Sandra walked over to the chair and ran her fingers along the grain of the wood. "Did you build this?" He nodded. "Right after Kim died. I brought her ashes up here and sat for hours, waiting for the pain to quiet down." He looked out over the view, the memories etched across his face. But the quiet didn't come until I stopped trying to fight it. Until I just let it sit beside me. Sandra sat down slowly, gazing at the horizon. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "Even the pain. Especially the pain." Keanu lowered himself onto the grass beside her, resting his head against her knee. "You're the first person I've ever brought here." She smoothed his hair back gently. "Then maybe it's time we bring someone else. Not a ghost, not a memory, but a new beginning." His eyes met hers, questioning, hoping. "What do you mean?" She smiled, tears caught in the corner of her lashes. "I mean, I don't want to go back to separate lives. I don't want this to be a memory. I want it to be a beginning. You and me, a life built here, or anywhere, as long as it's together." He sat up now, searching her face as if making sure it wasn't a dream. "Are you sure? The world will pull. The noise will come." She nodded. "Let it. We've found something louder than the world, and quieter too. We've found presence. Peace. I've spent years pretending to be okay, smiling on red carpets, giving answers I didn't believe, laughing in interviews when all I wanted was for someone to ask if I was tired of pretending. You didn't ask. You just let me stop pretending. And now I want to live in that truth." Keanu took both her hands. "Then let's build it. Let's stop saying someday and just begin." That night, they returned to the cabin and sat by the fire again. But this time it felt different. This time it wasn't just refuge. It was foundation. They talked about what it might look like. Fewer films, more silence. More time in places where no one asked for autographs. Time to read, to garden, to adopt an old dog that no one else wanted. They laughed at the idea of a Saturday market booth selling handmade candles. They dreamed out loud, not as actors but as people. Keanu looked into the flames, his voice quiet. "Do you think we deserve this?" Sandra leaned her head against his. "We don't have to earn what already belongs to us. Peace is our birthright. We just finally stopped running from it. There was no ring, no announcement, no Instagram post, just a decision not to go back, not to unsee what had been revealed between them, a decision to stay, not just at the cabin, but in the life they had stumbled into when the world went quiet enough for them to hear each other again." Weeks passed, and then months. The tabloids tried to guess where they had gone. Interviews speculated. Former co-stars gave vague answers. But no one knew, because it wasn't a disappearance. It was a return to the most sacred part of themselves. Together, they began rebuilding. Not a brand, not a public image, but a home. Sandra took up pottery, her hands finally steady enough to shape something without shaking. Keanu kept writing in the same notebook, except now the pages were filled not with grief, but with gratitude. They adopted a dog, just like they promised, an old mutt with one blind eye and a bark that made no sense. They named him Quiet. And on the morning of their one-year anniversary, Keanu led her back up to the wooden chair on the ridge. But this time there were 2 chairs, one for each of them, facing the horizon, facing the life they had built from brokenness. Sandra laughed when she saw them. "This looks like a painting," she said. Keanu pulled something from his pocket, an old photograph, the one of his fiancée. He looked at it one last time, kissed the corner, and buried it beneath a stone. "Thank you," he whispered to the wind, and then he turned to Sandra and smiled. "I'm ready now." They sat down in the chairs, hand in hand as the sun rose in full behind the hills, not looking back, not waiting for applause, just present, just whole, just finally home.